Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, you have the most recent version of recent reads. Did not mean to use the word recent twice, but we're gonna go with it. So I'm gonna start off this week on a Monday because I finished a book yesterday. I finished it after I wrapped up last week's recent read, and that is Fire by Kristin Cashore. So this is my first time continuing on in the series, and I knew that this is more of a companion novel than a direct sequel. In fact, the events in this book take place decades before the events in Graceling, and they take place in a very different part of the world where you don't really have Gracelings. What you have are monsters. So those monsters are those same animals, but they are so brightly and unnaturally colored, and they have alluring sense, but they're especially vicious and etc. And you know, there's this lore, are there human monsters? And turns out there are not many. Fire is the only one. And this story, at first, I wasn't quite sure what I was reading or getting into because some of the stuff was a little muddled. Some of the transitions in time were not distinctly talked about. The relationship that she has with Archer, who you first see and encounter very early on in the book. So weird. Does not make a lot of sense. The thing I like about that though, it's that so many characters call them out on it and they're like, you guys have the weirdest relationship ever. But there was a lot of it that just felt like, yeah, this is interesting, this is fine, this is surface level. But at the same time, subtly, Kristin Cashore was sort of like seeding all of these hooks into me, so that by the time we got towards the end of it, I could not put it down. I absolutely loved the relationship that developed between Fire and her love interest. The way that things just unfolded, it was so emotional, so gut-wrenching. I finished this book going, I love this book. How did I get to this point that I love this book? So I have no idea how to rate it. Probably will end up being a 4.5 star, not a 5 star, because there were points early on when I was like, I don't understand what's happening here. But I don't know how Kristin Cashore does it, but the way that she builds the relationships, the way that she explores the character and the complex parental relationships that these characters, Fire and her main love interest, have with their father, neither of whom are actually alive in the story, but they are still very present. So it's phenomenal what she's done with it. And I went and I looked at the synopses of the other 3 books, and it doesn't look like we get back to this world, which makes me sad. But this week is off to a good start. Okay, so not a reading update because I haven't finished anything yet, but I knew I got a package because I saw my aunt bringing it in, and I was like, oh, well, maybe it's one of the books I ordered, or maybe it's that ARC that I won as a giveaway. No, so I recently became a patron of Beautiful Bookish Bethany, and I just really love the content that she puts out, and I love being a supporter. And she did this thing where she sent books to all the people who became her Patreon in that segment, and that's what this is. So I'm not going to show the other side, obviously, because it has both of our addresses on it, but I have no idea what it is, but I'm so excited to see. Oh, okay. I said I was open to getting ARCs as well because, hey, why not? I don't know anything about this, but it looks super cool. So obviously this is not the finished cover. This is Blood Debts by Terry J. Benton Walker, and I don't know anything about it, but I'm excited. The little blurb on the back says, a deadly tale of sacrifice and betrayal in magical modern day New Orleans. That sounds super exciting. Okay, 30 years after the greatest magical massacre in their city's history, the rightful heirs of a stolen throne set out to right the wrongs in their family's past and bring about the justice they're owed. Okay, so this sounds really interesting. I don't know much about it, but see, here's a little bookmark, clicking it, nice. I like how thin this is. Okay, the battery is about to die, but I'm actually really excited about this, so I'll have to read more about this and find out more, but I'm so excited. Okay, it's only a couple minutes later. I looked this up. This is a 2023 release. It hasn't been released yet. And I remember she has read this. I remember reading, I don't know if she must have read it. I remember hearing her mention this, and then when seeing the cover on Storygraph, I was like, oh, it's that one. It's YA, it's releasing in April, and I'm super excited about this. Okay, I am back with another reading update. It is Saturday afternoon. I could have updated earlier in the week, but just the timing never worked out. Like either I had been just after a run and my hair looked awful, or it was just after a shower and my hair wasn't dry. And normally I don't necessarily care about that, but I just was like, I don't feel like it right now. So I have two for you. And these are both Book of the Month books. I have interesting thoughts. So it's really interesting that I sort of am comparing them against each other. And before I get to what those two books are, the reason I haven't had as many updates is because the audiobook I've been reading, I switched to the audiobook of Morgenthau, which is a nearly 800-page book. I am very close to finishing that, so I will have thoughts about that. Hopefully in my last update tomorrow, potentially. Back to these books. One of these is a debut. I don't know how many the author of the other one has written, but I had very different experiences with them. So, and they're also very different books. Now, I didn't hate this book, but there was something about it that I just never really super engaged with. And it was very interesting to read this book and just figure out, why am I not connecting? Why is this just average for me? And I'm still gonna hold on to this book because I have thoughts about it and I want to have a Book of the Month collection, and this wasn't a bad novel. It really taught me stuff about reading tastes and character exploration. And the thing that happens in here, the reason that I got this book was the premise, the hook, where the story opens and the main character is grieving the tragic loss of her husband who committed suicide, and she was the one that found him. And so we know this, and it's mentioned and alluded to in the book, but nothing is ever really clear on what happened, and he doesn't leave a note. He doesn't leave anything behind. So she doesn't have that closure, even though it's not necessarily closure for people to have the note and have the person explain what was going through their head at the moment. It started off emotional and you're getting into the character, and she is really in the depths of grief, and it's really hard-hitting at the beginning. I'm not here to say that her journey wasn't realistic for someone in this kind of grief, but it didn't feel like her as a character ever really learned anything. Throughout the book, she would have these aha moments, or moments that would be phrased like she's learning something, but then almost like a paragraph or so later, or a page or so later, she would say she still did that other thing. So did she actually learn anything, or didn't she? And in fact, when she starts to meet new characters at the end of the book, she meets them because she's avoiding therapy and hiding it from her family, who is desperately trying to help her. And yet somehow that's painted as a good thing, and like she automatically makes these friends and they're like bosom buddies or whatever. And then there's something that happens halfway through that gets revealed, and you'd think it'd have a big impact on her, and it does, sort of. And there's also a character in here who is the best friend of her husband, and I don't understand the point of him. He seems like this character who's supposed to, it's like his only purpose was to reveal something to her mother-in-law, who has always hated her. And I'm like, why do we even have this character in here? I don't get it. And that was the frustrating thing for me, is that she never grew. And at the end of the book, I'm looking at, the future that she has laid out in front of her, going, I don't know that it's going to be rosy. I don't know that you're not going to stay stuck, mired in all of this grief, even though you say you're fine. So I never really engaged with the book. And I read this, it took me 3 days to read it, and I just wasn't reading it as quickly. Now, I was reading about 100 pages a day, hence 3 days, it's 300 pages. But I think if it had been a more gripping book, I would have read it faster. And I know that because this took me a day to read. Now, that day was split up over last night and this morning, but it took me a day to read this book. I probably am going to rate this 5 stars. That other one, probably 3.5, because I did not enjoy my journey with that other one. This is a phenomenal book. It talks about things that are sort of known about, but it talks about it in such a reality, in such a way that just grips you. I was reading it. I went over to my mom and stepdad's because we celebrated my grandpa's birthday today, and we celebrated it over there. And I was reading, and something happens in here about 45-ish% of the way through the book. I literally gasped, and I was like, oh. And my mom looks over and goes, what's wrong? Like, it's the book. And so I talked her through the plot of the book while on our run this morning, and she was right there with me. And in this book, the main character is a recently graduated nurse. She went to Tuskegee, and she was raised in an area of Alabama where there was a lot of poverty, but she didn't live in poverty because her family was a little bit more well off because her father was a successful doctor. And she goes, he wanted her to become a doctor. She's like, no, I'm going to become a nurse. And she goes and she works for a clinic, a family planning clinic in rural Alabama. Well, small town Alabama. And it's run by a white woman, an awful white woman. And it's also at the time where Roe versus Wade had just been handed down, and they were coming out with more, like, there were birth control pills. There was also a birth control shot that later got withdrawn from the market because it was shown to cause cancer. But they were still giving it and administering it without really having done these studies. And of course, who were they administering it to? And this is going through talking about mainly how Black women and girls were taken advantage of and looked down upon when it came to the medical system with regards to family planning, and like how different women were encouraged to get their tubes tied, sterilize themselves, and whether or not there was informed consent about a lot of these, because a lot of these rural people had not had the opportunity to go to school or the availability or the finances, and so a lot of them were illiterate, and so thus the people would get consent, but it was not informed consent. They were just making a mark based on and trusting what the person told them. And this girl becomes involved, and she learns a lot about what has been going on in her town. And I'm not going to say any more about it. Involves these two sisters, and the author bases it on a real life court case where the person involved was the social worker. In this case, she's acting as their nurse. And it really did go through and address this major issue. And this is just really hard hitting, but I became so engrossed and engaged with this story from the beginning. I read it so quickly. These books, they're about the same size. This took me 3 days to read. This took me a day. This is so profound, so hard-hitting. This makes me want to pick up more historical fiction, because historical fiction that is done well and tells these stories, this is what we need more of. And this is hands down one of the best things that I've read this month. Okay, I'm here to wrap up this recent reads with 2 more updates. I finished an audiobook and I finished a physical book since I last updated. The audiobook was not a chore, but it was culminating almost 3 weeks worth of reading this book. So I'll talk about that next. And that is Morgenthau, which is Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. I think that the subtitle gives it a little bit of a different view on the three and a half-ish generations that Andrew Meier talks about. This is more a biography of three specific men: Henry Sr., Henry Jr., and Bob Morgenthau. He talks a little bit at the beginning about Lazarus Morgenthau, which was the patriarch of the family, the adult Morgenthau that immigrated from Germany, but doesn't talk about him long in there. But it's more biography of those men, because what ends up happening in this book is there is discussion, there's a biography, there's things talked about for whichever man is the adult at the time or in his prime, or things are happening to him that you need to know about, basically. And so most of the first portion of the book, it's about Henry Sr. And then as Henry Jr. becomes an adult, he's talked about more. But while it's about Henry Sr., of course, it mentions when his children are born and a little bit about his children and his wife at various times. But then once the narrative switches over, gradually to Henry Jr., he never really talks about the other siblings that Henry Jr. had. I mean, they're mentioned, but the focus is not on them. And you can imagine, with the length of this book, if Meier had talked about all of the people in this book, he would have had to do multiple volumes of this size, because one of the people that I didn't know was connected to the Morgenthaus is the historian Barbara Tuchman. I had no idea that she is Henry Morgenthau Sr.'s granddaughter. So she's the daughter of his, I think, oldest daughter. And she actually was a very young child coming over to visit her grandfather when her grandfather was serving as ambassador in the Ottoman Empire. So I find that absolutely fascinating. And of course, Meier mentions that, but he doesn't talk long about it. And you have a whole biography of Barbara Tuchman. So it's not really about a dynasty. It's more about those men. And I don't know whether or not Meier was the one that chose the subtitle or whatever. A lot of times that's an editor's choice. But this must have taken years to research. It is so well documented. It is so well written and compiled together. It's a huge expanse of time and content and subject matter that Meier talks about here with what each man deals with, because Henry Sr. is more of a real estate mogul, basically, back in the turn of the century, and then he deals with becoming an ambassador, getting involved in politics, but serving the Ottoman Empire, dealing with a genocide unfolding in front of him. And then with Henry Jr. wants to be a farmer. He probably struggled with dyslexia. And then Henry Jr. becomes friends with FDR and gets catapulted into government, but then catapults out of it. And then Bob Morgenthau is the most successful education-wise, but he goes into the law. And so a lot of that stuff is talking about the different cases and things that he's going over. So there's so much stuff that Meier is talking about in here. This is not a book for everybody, but I loved it. It took a while to get through, but I went into it with the plan of, I'm not going to sit and read until it's done and not read anything else. I read a little bit of this at a time, and then I transitioned over and got the audiobook version of it, because I'm like, you know what? I really want to be reading some other things as well, and I don't think that physically reading it, I'm going to get through it in time to finish up in February, I should say. And I think that was a good choice to switch over to the audiobook. Really good audiobook. I love consuming nonfiction that way. This is a really good book. I believe I ended up rating it 4 stars, maybe 4.5, but it's gonna take something mammoth, not in size, because this is mammoth in size, but something really significant for nonfiction to rate super high for me, like a 5-star read, just because there's not that personal enjoyment level that you get when you sort of identify with something like you do with a fiction book. So this is 4-star read, but really good, and I probably will be getting a physical copy of this. The last book that I finished up in this recent reads is book 3 in the Graceling Realms series, Bitter Blue. So this is more of a follow-up. You have some return characters from the first book, and it stars Bitter Blue, who was a 10-year-old in the first book, and now she's queen in her own right. Her father is Lek, the awful villain, basically, that you've seen in all 3 books at various times. And I have come to realize that Kristin Cashore's narratives are incredibly confusing. They just are. That's how she writes. She doesn't have a lot of distinctness to the different parts in her book. And the problem, I think, with this one is Lek's grace is very confusing in itself. It makes people think things that aren't true because he has the ability to basically say things and make them believe it. But he's gone now, and basically everyone's trying to recover, but Lek made them do some absolutely terrible things. And this book unpacks how people are responding to this. They don't necessarily always do the right thing, but because there was just so much mental manipulation, that adds to the confusion in how Cashore writes her narratives. And so this was not really a favorite for me. It took me a little bit to get into it, more so because I was a little bit sleepy as I was trying to read it at first. You know, that happens. And also other things were going on. And so I didn't get into it as quickly, but I didn't really get into the first 2 as quickly either. But then the end came and I was just sucked in. And like I talked about Fire, how she got her narrative hooks in me, Cashore did. That didn't happen with this. There was a relationship building with this, but I'm not really sure that I liked where it went. And yes, I did look at the character lists in the other 2 books to see if the love interest appears. It doesn't look like he does, which is kind of disappointing. So this is not a bad book, but it's my least favorite out of the 3 that I've read so far. Let's see if I can talk. So I've rated it a 3.5 stars. Not bad. Hopefully, if the final 2 can bump it back up to 4 stars minimum, I will be keeping this series. But if the remaining 2 are, you know, 3.5 stars or 3, I probably will be getting rid of the series. So still on the fence as to what I think about these books. So there you have it. There is, I've lost count of what recent reads this is. 8 maybe. That's this week of recent reads. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.